The F-8E flies out for the American Air Tree in War Thunder. How does it compare? Let's find out. The F-8 Crusader came out of a U.S. Navy requirement for a new supersonic fighter in 1952. The Navy had studied air combat during the Korean War and determined that they needed a new, carrier-capable fighter with heavy cannons, a reliable engine, a good rate of climb, and supersonic performance. The Vought Company submitted a highly innovative design that was quickly selected. It included a high-mounted wing configuration which was pretty uncommon at the time, as well as an afterburning engine, 4 cannons, and importantly, it had internal space for avionics upgrades. One of the key features of the design is that it had been planned to use electronic systems that were just on the horizon but not yet available. For example, the radar set wasn't fitted until the aircraft was already in pre-production flight testing in 1958, but integrating it ended up being a really easy program since the plane was designed for a radar system even though it wasn't available early on. Notably lacking, though, was the capability to carry air-to-air missiles. This was eventually retrofitted by adding some unusual cheek pylons, but the F-8 got nicknamed the last gunfighter, since it was the last US-produced fighter intended to use internal guns as its primary weapon. The most notable feature is, of course, the variable incidence wing. This allows the plane to generate an enormous amount of lift in a landing configuration, and it also allows a nose-flat landing profile that was seen as a pretty good benefit for carrier operations. The Crusader saw combat service over Vietnam, reaching a kill ratio of about 6-to-1 depending on the source. It was exported to France, and I have a review up of the French version by the way, and it also ended up being produced in over a dozen versions, including prototypes and operational models. The F-8E, which first flew in 1961, ended up being a major production version that included expanded weapons compatibility, and the US Navy retired the air superiority versions after a long service life in 1976. What we're looking at in War Thunder is the F-8E, a naval jet fighter and rank 7 of the American Air Tree at battle rating 10.3. This is primarily an air superiority jet, and it doesn't get any kind of ballistics computer. But it does carry a radar warning receiver, countermeasures, and the AN/APQ-94 radar set. This is a somewhat basic level radar, no look-down modes or anything, and importantly, no boresight targeting. But you can still narrow the dish angle a bit to try and offset that and make targeting a little easier. Notably, the plane also carries an infrared search and track unit for air combat, which is highly unusual for an American fighter. For weapons, the F-8E gets its primary armament of 4 20mm cannons, along with a surprisingly flexible set of external weapons. It can take dumb bombs, rocket pods, bullpup missiles, and air-to-air missiles in pretty varied loadouts. Its air-to-ground missile is the AGM-12B bullpup. This is a manual command line-of-sight weapon with a huge warhead that can be pretty effective if you can get good at using it. For air-to-air missiles, it gets 2 heat-seeking versions of the Sidewinder, the AIM-9B and D. These are both caged-seeker weapons, but the D is a huge upgrade over the B, and actually ends up being reasonably useful. It also carries the semi-active radar-guided AIM-9C. This has very similar performance to the AIM-9D, but obviously uses radar guidance, which makes it useful for all aspect attacks. Notably, all of the F-8's Sidewinders can be taken on single and double pylons, or mounted with a couple of Zuni rockets. The flight performance of the F-8E has some heavy caveats, but overall it's really good. It accelerates well throughout its power curve, comparable to other single-engine afterburning fighters around this BR, and it has a strong rate of climb that can help positioning at the early stages of a match. It also has an air brake that's pretty effective, and it can drop combat flaps up to around 1,000 kilometers an hour, which is impressive. The good engine performance ends up being kind of important, as the plane's overall maneuverability is entirely dependent on its speed. Below 400 kilometers an hour, like a lot of other jets, it suffers in turns and its rate of roll is pretty bad. But if you can keep the airspeed above roughly 600 kilometers an hour, the F-8E turns into an absolutely amazing dogfighter. Every aspect of its maneuverability goes from crap to gold very quickly. At high speeds, it rolls well, pulls into turns very hard, and can at least keep up with basically any other dogfighter in this BR range. The F-8E seems to have a sweet spot for energy retention right at around 650 kilometers an hour, if you're careful and not too aggressive. I made sure to include combat footage fighting across different airspeeds in this review, so that you could see the difference, and at least in my opinion, it's really obvious. The only major problem with the performance is that the Crusader, well, it's just not very fast. Its maximum speed is kinda shit. The plane can push past Mach 1 at lower altitudes, but just barely. And below about 3,000 meters, almost any other supersonic fighter will probably be able to outrun you in a flat chase. The plane also has a reputation for having wing rip problems, but I don't personally run into them very often. If it's happening to you, though, you can just unequip the hydraulic boosters upgrade, and you'll be fine. In air battles, the F-8E ends up being a pretty flexible plane. Kind of. If you want to use it for points grinding, you can absolutely load up some bombs on the wing pylons and go hit a strategic base before you dive in for air combat. But without a ballistics computer, I personally find high-speed bombing passes with the F-8 to be a bit more difficult than in comparable jets, and I'm not sure why. Maybe the extra tenth of a second in drop time off of the high-mounted wings has something to do with it, but regardless, it'll take a little practice to do accurate level bombing. For air combat, this is one of those planes where its dogfight performance is good enough and its weapons are effective enough where I don't usually do all of the usual cat and mouse positioning tactics, but tend to just look for the thickest fight I can find and jump right into the middle of it. Now, if that's not your style, you can use its good engine performance to go for a positional advantage early on and look for one-on-one engagements. Honestly, the F-8E is flexible enough for pretty much any air combat playstyle. The ability to take a mix of infrared and radar-guided missiles is also a huge boost, and taking a loadout of 2 AIM-9Ds and 2 AIM-9Cs provides some great situational options and can absolutely get you kills that you might otherwise miss out on. And there are a couple examples of that in the gameplay in this review. My only complaint about the F-8E in air battles is that the field of view on the infrared search and track is a little more vertically narrow than I would prefer, but still, it's great to have it anyway. Now, in terms of close air support, I personally have more luck with the rocket pods than with the bombs or bullpups, but aiming them can still be pretty difficult at high speed without any kind of ballistics computer. The countermeasures help survivability at this BR range, and don't underestimate using this for air sweeps, just hunting helicopters and attackers out over a ground battle. Visually, the F-8E is an odd-looking plane, but it's got a big smile, and the Crusader's kind of grown on me over the years. The variable incidence wing is just awesome, but unfortunately, this version of the jet doesn't get any of the cool custom skins that some of the others do. However, you can still find some on War Thunder Live. Landing the F-8E is easy, with caveats. It has a pretty flat landing profile thanks to the variable incidence wing, and you'll actually find that it might be a little difficult to get the nose down at low speeds with the flaps and wing deployed. Since it's a naval jet, it doesn't have a drag chute, and you won't really get to use its arrestor hook, which means that it tends to have pretty long landing runs. Also, since the undercarriage is kinda narrow, try to avoid fishtailing to dump speed after touching down. It's likely to flip over. The cockpit on the F-8E has great visibility to the front and sides, but none whatsoever to the rear. Its instruments are large and easy to read, and the radar scope is in an excellent spot. Overall, decent cockpit, and it's easy to fly in VR, even if you can't really see behind you. To close out on the F-8E Crusader. This jet has good flight performance, amazing dogfight agility at high speeds, a good selection of weapons, and an infrared search and track unit. However, its top speed isn't great, its radar doesn't get an ACM boresight mode, and it doesn't have a ballistics computer. The final verdict on the F-8E in the American tech tree is that this jet is outstanding in air battles, but it suffers kinda bad in close air support from its lack of a ballistics computer. If flown well, this plane can absolutely dominate air combat at its BR. As always, thanks for watching.